Welcome back. We are covering the study guide 1860 to 1862 in this particular video. All right, we're not going to cover every battle in the Civil War, but we will hit the significant ones. So let's get to sharing. We left off with the secession of these 11 states. We're going to talk about the border states here momentarily. Lincoln will not take office until April, March. Inauguration day used to be in March. Today it's in January, but it used to be in March. So we're stuck with dear old James Buchanan trying to be president. And as you can see from this exchange, seems to be one of the few people unaware of the crisis he's facing. Yeah, not exactly one of our better presidents. He didn't do a whole lot to try to stop secession from happening. He believed that history would vindicate that decision. He is still waiting for history to vindicate that decision. Only 4 of the states that seceded ever gave any justification why. And if you analyze the language, you can kind of see here how that breaks down. Texas is one of them. This military protection in Texas, it's mainly because of the Comanche. It was felt that the U.S. military wasn't doing enough to protect Texans from the Comanche. But otherwise, you have a pretty similar range of reasons there. And you can read all that stuff on the internet for yourself. Context, basically, language, historical exposition, et cetera, et cetera. Only South Carolina not voting half to slavery. Now, the states that seceded wanted to get a government up and running before Lincoln took office. And so the Confederacy, switch these around, the Confederate States of America will form very, very quickly. Their constitution, they'll form a constitution and elect a president and do all those other things. Their constitution is very similar to the U.S. Constitution. If you read them, they're nearly identical side by side. There are a few changes. No tariffs, obviously. Slavery was guaranteed in the states and territories of the Confederacy. They elect Jefferson Davis. He will turn out to be the one and only president of the Confederacy. A lot of the debate, what would have happened if they had picked somebody a little more radical, a little more committed to bending the Constitution the way Lincoln will bend the Constitution, which we'll get to in a moment. He also did not have the touch of that a common politician needs. Politics is as much about people handling as it is about the levers and pulleys that make government work. And he just didn't have that touch. Usually presidents are very charismatic people who will feel like your best friend after you interact with them for 30 seconds. I've known people who have met Bill Clinton, kind of said, yeah, like within 30 seconds, you can't help but be overwhelmed by just the magnetism of the personality. I've heard the same thing about Obama and even Reagan, but he did not have these skills. Verena Davis was her own husband. And as you can see here, he's not, and this will play out, he will not be the kind of person who's sort of open to a lot of suggestion from his cabinet, his Secretary of War and his Secretary of State and all that, whereas Lincoln will be very, very open to suggestions by his cabinet, his team of rivals, quote unquote. If you've ever seen that movie Lincoln, the one with Daniel Day-Lewis playing Lincoln, it explores some of that relationship between Lincoln and his subordinates. This is the swearing in of Jefferson Davis in Mobile, Alabama, or Mobile. For some reason, they're going to move the Confederacy to Virginia. We'll get to that in a second. Primarily for, and this isn't on your study guide, but I'll go ahead and tell you. One, there were fewer mosquitoes in Virginia than there were in Alabama. Alabama. And two, there were better hotels. It's something I stumbled across last year in a book I was reading about the year 1860. Really just the 4 months of 1860 where all this was happening. The Confederate vice president's a guy named Alexander Stephens. We really won't hear of him again until Reconstruction. But he did do a curious thing, like right in the middle one day, he was giving a speech where he kind of was explaining how the Constitution, the new Constitution would work and the powers of government. He dropped this quote in there. Which is a strange thing to mention when you're talking about taxation and tariffs and all that kind of stuff, to just sort of go off on this sort of saying the quiet part out loud. This is called the Cornerstone speech because it's Cornerstone. So very strange thing, but again, feels like he's saying the quiet part out loud. Now, the shooting. As the Confederacy began to form, the military bases in the South began to be surrendered to the Union, to the Confederacy. Like here in Texas, all of the military bases in Texas were surrendered to Texas, to the state of Texas when it joined the Confederacy. One place that the Union did not give up was Fort Sumter. It is essentially a large rock out in the middle. This is Charleston, South Carolina, that surrounds it. You can see the city of Charleston and the other places. And the Confederacy was attempting to hold on. I'm sorry, the Union was attempting to hold on to it for as much as possible. There had been an attempt to resupply it here when Buchanan was still president. And the Confederates had built up, remember, a battery is artillery. So these batteries and forts have been built up here alongside of it. Eventually, on April 12th, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a battle that lasted for about 36 hours. Before Fort Sumter finally surrendered. The fort was pretty beaten up by then, and parts of it had caught fire. But this will be beginning of the war. Now, problems with the Union Army. The Army was very, very small, only about 16,000 soldiers. A third are going to quit and join the Confederacy. The leadership is past its prime. People like Winfield Scott, who've been commissioned when Thomas Jefferson was president 50 years earlier. So not really in the best shape here. Third, no intelligence. The Army had no idea, like, where are the roads in the South? Where are the bridges in the South? What shape are the roads in? Like, all the kind of stuff you need to know if you're going to invade enemy territory. Nobody knew. Okay? So a lot of problems with the Army, problems that are going to have to be fixed. Problems with supply systems, where are we going to get all the supplies for an army that's eventually going to have 1.8 million men in it? All that stuff is going to have to be built during the war. Lincoln also has to deal with the border states. Now, the border states have slavery, but have not seceded by the time of Fort Sumter. And there were 4 border states. Let's look at them in first of all, Kentucky declared itself neutral. It will lean Union, but officially neutral. Missouri wanted to leave, but it'll be occupied by the Union Army in order to prevent that. And Missouri will become, you remember what Kansas was with guerrilla warfare and the insurgency and the butchery. That's what Kansas will become. I mean, that's what Missouri will become for about 5 years. Partisans, insurgency, counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare. And a lot of people will see out west after the war, like the James brothers and people like that will have gotten their start in Missouri. Delaware has no secession movement. There were, by this point, only about 9,000 slaves left in Delaware, and that number had been dropping precipitously every time there was a census. Delaware is probably one of those states where slavery would have simply dried up on its own had there been no war. Maryland also wanted to leave, but Lincoln threatened to arrest state government if they tried. And I think you heard me use the phrase bend the Constitution a few minutes ago. That is definitely bending it. But it worked. And lawsuits after the Civil War, the Supreme Court held up the decisions Lincoln had made. Lincoln made a few other decisions right after Fort Sumter during the first month of his presidency. Actually, let's start with the one that kind of ties into what's going on up there in Maryland. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, which again would allow for indefinite detention. Remember, habeas corpus, if you are arrested, the government has to provide reasons why you were arrested. They cannot simply hold you indefinitely. Suspending habeas corpus allows for that. This is a very controversial decision. The Constitution does allow for it. Article 1, I think Section 8 says you can suspend habeas corpus in times of external invasion or internal rebellion. The problem is that Article 1 is about Congress and the powers Congress has. Let me double check that. Yes. So it's Congress's power according to the Constitution. Habeas corpus will be suspended again in the 1870s by Ulysses S. Grant when he's president, but he will do it with Congress, whereas Lincoln has simply done it on his own. And if there's a weak spot to how far Lincoln was willing to bend the Constitution, this is it. This is bending it pretty hard. Second, Lincoln proclaimed that an insurrection had broken out and called for volunteers. This will never be a war. Lincoln, through the next 4 years, will never refer to this as a war. It will always be an insurrection. It will always be a rebellion. It will always be something like that. But he will never call this a war because war, by definition, can only exist between two sovereign nations. And so calling this a war would validate the existence of the Confederacy. So Lincoln will never use the word war in his speech or his writing. He'll never use it. And finally, Lincoln will order a blockade of the southern coast, which legally is an act of war. Overall strategies in the war are going to be quite different. The Confederacy really only has to defend and survive while hoping for Britain or France to intervene. It is much easier to defend territory than it is to conquer territory. And so the Confederacy, which takes up 750,000 square miles, has a lot of rivers, woods, Appalachian, terrible roads. It just has to defend and hope for Britain or France to intervene. And we will look at how this will drive some of the decision making. The Union has a much more difficult. It has to conquer and hold, and that is a much more difficult thing to do in a war, to conquer and hold. The Union's plan for the war called the Anaconda Plan. Scott's Great Snake. You can see it here. So blockade the southern coast. Okay, and we can see that eventually we will get a blockade. It's going to take a while for it to happen. Okay, and these don't have to be done in any particular order. Sees the Mississippi and the Tennessee rivers. So the Mississippi and then the Tennessee sees those rivers, and then finally cut the Confederacy into pieces and squeeze each piece into submission. And so this is what it looks like by the end. The blockade, the Mississippi River has been seized, the Tennessee River has been seized, and you can see the Confederacy has been cut into pieces and is being squeezed. This piece here, Georgia through Virginia, at the time that the war ended, there were 5 Union armies operating just in this one section. So that's the squeeze part. We don't have time to go through every single battle of the Civil War. For most people, whether or not the war is going well or not depends on how things are going in Virginia. And the reason that is because the Union's capital is here, Washington, D.C., and the Confederate capital is here, Richmond. Here. They had moved from Mobile up to Richmond. Today, let's find out how long that would take you to get to Washington. So let's say our destination is Washington, D.C. We are going to leave from Richmond, Virginia. That is 2 hours and 5 minutes by car today. It's 108 miles, the shortest distance. So, as you can imagine, for most people, how the war is going depends on how things are going in Virginia. This map is only these spots that are where the fights, that's only for 1 year. This is only for 1862. So 1861 and 1862. So Manassas, Fredericksburg, all these places, the Peninsula Campaign down here, Lynchburg, Charlottesville, all these places in the Appalachian. Yeah, just 1 year. So the first, there have been some sporadic fighting that broke out after Fort Sumter, but the first sort of recognized battle happens at Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. This is a Confederate victory. Not only did the Union Army retreat, the Union Army panicked and fled for their lives. So it's a big victory for the Confederacy. You can see here these quotes from Jefferson Davis. And it was even noticed overseas. Whoops. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's somewhat equivalent to the Treasury Secretary in our system. There are several contributions to naval warfare that are made during the war, and a lot of them come from the Confederacy, which is surprising. The first are the ironclads. This is an ironclad. Oops, I misspelled clad because I cannot spell. There we go. So this is a ship with iron plating. I'll show you an example here in a minute. The Confederacy got these out first. The Union will get them out eventually as well. The problem, though, for the Confederacy is they'll never really have the engines necessary to run the ironclads. They'll often have to tow them with wooden ships to their location. Remember, we talked in Unit 3 about the manufacturing problems in the Confederacy. These are naval mines. This works the way a landmine does. You bump up against it and kaboom. And then submarines. The Confederates will put the very first submarine into combat, the H.L. Hunley, which will complete one mission before sinking and not being found again for like 80 or 90 years. It has been found, it has been with the remains of the crew on board who have been given proper burials, but it has been found, it's in a museum now where they keep it in a special tank of water to try to slow down the disintegration. Probably, this is an ironclad. This is at the Vicksburg National Park. This is the only ironclad on display in the world. So if you're ever in Mississippi, I would recommend hitting up Vicksburg National Park. Some of this is original. The part that like looks really bad is original, and then they've rebuilt around it. You can see the iron plating and the way the cannon sticks out on the side. And then towards the rear, you can still see some of the original ship. And you can see the wheels that turn the paddles and everything. And there's boilers down here that I'm not showing you a picture of, but they would have produced steam in order to turn the paddles. So it's pretty neat if you ever are in Vicksburg and want to swing by and take a look at it. The most significant event in terms of naval warfare happened at Hampton Roads on March 8th, 1862. And what happened there is two ironclads fought each other. For the first time in history, two iron ships fought each other. This is one of the ships. It's a Union ship. These were the Merrimack and the Monitor. This is the Monitor here, which had a turret that would rotate, so you didn't have to put guns on both sides all the way down, like we saw back here. This, you just rotate the turret. So these two ironclads simply shot at each other for about 3 hours. You can see some of the dents in the Monitor because the cannonballs are just bouncing off, right? They're firing point blank at each other, but things are just bouncing off. Nobody won. It is a withdrawal, but it is the end of the Wooden Navy. Every other navy in the world at that point became obsolete. This is the birth of the modern Navy, as seen here at Hampton Roads on March 8th, 1862. Very quickly, the Union got busy trying to get into the Mississippi River, and they were able to do so from the southern end very, very quickly. The Confederacy had felt that these two forts, Fort Phillip and Fort Jackson, would be enough to protect New Orleans. So there wasn't a whole lot of presence of any type of naval forces or army forces once you got past those forts on your way to New Orleans. And eventually, Union forces they fought. The Union Navy did fight these two forts for a while, but then they decided they were never going to be able to destroy the forts, so they would just go full speed past them. And that's basically what happened. They waited until the wind was with them. They put up all the sails and they went past the two forts, guns blazing, and succeeded. And once they got past those two ports, this is about April of 1862, there was nothing to stop them. And so here we see the Union Navy having come into New Orleans and captured the city. And New Orleans would remain under Union control for the entire rest of the war. So that Anaconda Plan is starting to take shape because we're trying to get the Mississippi River. Okay, and getting New Orleans is an important step. In September of 1862, the Confederacy under Robert E. Lee invaded Maryland. This was done for two reasons. One, to liberate Maryland. You recall that Maryland had wanted to leave the Union and was being held in by force. But it was also felt that this would impress Britain and or France and lead one of them to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. You remember way back in Unit 2 when the Americans won that battle at Saratoga and it led to the French finally recognizing the United States as an independent nation? That's the same thing the Confederacy is trying to do here. If they can win a significant battle in Union territory, that will perhaps get recognition. So you can see the invasion route, Lee's forces coming up. Here's Harper's Ferry, which we talked about before when we were talking about John Brown. You can see the railroad tracks making an important spot. And then Union forces coming up and then hitting here at Antietam. Now, before we get to Antietam, we need to talk about George McClellan. McClellan was the Union commander. George McClellan. It's not fair. And McClellan had played an important role in the war. He had taken, that army that had been beaten back at Bull Run, he had taken that army and whipped it back into shape. He had modernized the Army training manual. He had set up the supply system for the food, the uniforms, and all that stuff. We're going to talk about some of that stuff later. But he had really done a very good job of putting the Army back together after Bull Run. So he's a very good general in those terms. He is not a great field commander. He's got some issues here. He's got some weaknesses. Shrink this down a little. So he's got some problems, and those problems are going to play a role in this draw, really. Problem number one is perfectionism. If you look at his reports and you look at his diary, his letters, he's always talking about how he's almost ready. The army is almost ready. We are just about ready to move. Second, he exaggerates the size of enemy forces. For instance, here at Antietam, which is where we're going to, Lee, his opponent, has 41,000 troops. McClellan is convinced that Lee has 150,000 troops. Okay, so he chronically exaggerates enemy forces. He often failed to let the War Department know what he was doing, which means he was not letting the president know what he was doing. He did not like Lincoln. He was contemptuous of the president, referring to him as a baboon. If you've ever seen a picture of Lincoln, his arms are very long. They're unnaturally long. And so referring to him, and McClellan was also pro-slavery. These problems, particularly number one and number two, are going to haunt him at Antietam. Antietam is one day, September 17th, 1862. All right. Early in the morning, most of the action is around this cornfield. All right. Here are your Confederate troops. Union troops are out here. Some heights. All right. But most of the action taking place from about 6 to 10 a.m. this cornfield. And about 10,000 men were either killed or wounded in those first 4 hours. The second battle then shifted to, and it's hard to see, but there's a road here. It's called the Sunken Road. Let me show you. These are dead in the Sunken Road. But it's this road right here, and the Confederates had it, and they could squat down, reload their gun, pop up, fire off a bullet, squat down, so on. So the fighting is mainly along this road. Here's the town of Sharpsburg back here. It took the Union Army about 3 hours. You can see how they're being repulsed. These New Yorkers, these people being repulsed. This Delaware being repulsed. So it took the Union Army about 3 hours to break through the sunken road. As you can see here, filled with the dead. At that point, when the breakthrough finally occurred, McClellan should have sent reinforcements, but he didn't. In fact, McClellan had about 10,000 men who would never see combat that day. McClellan held them way back in the rear for the entire day because he was convinced that Lee had 150,000 troops and they were just going to spring around and swamp him from the rear. So he never sent those extra troops in, which had he done so, it might have broken Confederate lines. The battle now shifts to, there's a stone bridge right here. There's a picture of it. Up along this ridge are a bunch of sharpshooters from Georgia as the Union tries to cross the bridge right here. So that takes about 3 hours. These 20th and 2nd of Georgia are up on that ridge. Some Union forces did try to get across here, but it's very difficult to get up. You almost have to climb up the wall of the creek. It's not like just walking through a creek and then you walk out the other side. You have to climb your way out. And so it was very, very difficult. And there were some more Georgians holding them off. Eventually, after 3 hours, the Union broke through the Glen. McClellan should have sent his reinforcements, but he didn't. And so that allowed the Confederacy to reform their lines and prevent any sort of breakthrough. 5,000 Americans died at Antietam or Sharpsburg, single bloodiest day in American history, twice the casualties of D-Day in 1944, more than we lost in 9/11. Now, the next day, September 18th, McClellan should have renewed the attack. He did not. And on the 19th, Confederate armies under Lee began their retreat. It took a visit to the battlefield by the president to get McClellan to pursue Lee's army as it was retreating. Like the president had to go to the battlefield, had to go to Antietam and tell the general to get it together and start pursuing the enemy. On the 30th, McClellan stopped after 2 whole days of pursuit, asked for more men. Lincoln fires McClellan. He had simply had enough of George McClellan's, frankly, being a chicken shit. Let's just call it for what it is. And so he fired him. Now, we've not seen the last of George McClellan. He'll be back again in 1864, but Lincoln fires him at this point. His next few generals he goes through aren't much better. Ambrose Burnside and then fighting Joe Hooker. They ain't going to be much better. All right, so that gets us through 1860 and 1861, 62 in the military situation. If you're looking on your study guide, Emancipation is next. That's actually going to be a handout I'm going to put in the Unit 4 folder. So there's no video lecture for Emancipation. There's simply a handout, and you can go through it while you look at the questions from the study guide. Financing the War in Medicine, that's the next video I'll see you in. And then after that, we will get to War Issues and Politics in 1863. Then do the important military of 1863, and then get to Behind the Front Lines, kind of a break from the military stuff before we move forward. All right, so I will see you in one of those videos sometime soon, and have a good day.